today. My name is Michael Lopez, and I'm the co-PI of the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families and a Principal Associate at Abt Associates. On behalf of the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, or in short, the Center, welcome to this webinar today. The Center, as you'll hear in more detail in a few minutes, was launched in 2013 and is designed to provide research and capacity building activities to help programs and policy better serve low-income Hispanic children and families across the country. The focus of today's webinar is on improving the current data infrastructure to better capture and reflect the diversity of the rapidly growing Hispanic population in the United States. First, we will focus on the findings from our review of 34 commonly used large data sets that often are used to examine a range of topics critical to the well-being of children and families, including Hispanic children and families. Then, we will hear from several national experts about the implications of these findings for the research community, as well as key policy and program stakeholders. It's our goal that this new research brief will help support the work of researchers interested in examining issues of relevance to the growing population of Hispanics across the country in ways that will not only help build new knowledge, but also will help inform policy and practice. During the webinar, if you have any technical or logistical questions about your connection to the webinar, please submit them online. You will see a box on the right-hand side of your screen, as indicated by the letters C and D on the graphic, where you can easily submit questions to our team. We will be monitoring incoming questions and we'll get back to you as soon as possible to help problem solve any technical problems with the connection. This also is the same place where you can submit questions to our panelists at any time during the presentation. We will queue up the questions as they come in and present them once all the presentations have been completed. We estimate that we will have about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. We also are live tweeting the presentation using #HispanicData. Please join the conversation. Finally, please note that we'll be posting the webinar recording and slides on the Center's website, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Now, I'd like to introduce the speakers for today's webinar. You will hear from 5 panelists. First, we'll hear some introductory remarks from Dr. Ann Rivera, who's a social science research analyst at the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within the Administration for Children and Families of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. She oversees research grants and contracts focused primarily on early care and education, specifically Head Start and child care programs aimed at improving human services for Hispanics. Dr. Rivera also is the Federal Project Officer for the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, so we're thrilled that she's here with us today. Then you will hear from the other co-PI of the Center, Dr. Lina Guzman, who is a senior researcher at Child Trends, where she oversees Child Trends Hispanic Institute. Her substantive research focuses on reproductive health and union formation among minority teens and young adults, with a particular focus on Latinos. Next, you will hear from the Deputy Director of the Center, Dr. Elizabeth Wildsmith, who is a senior researcher at Child Trends. Her substantive research focuses on reproductive health and family formation. Finally, you will hear from our 2 distinguished discussants, Dr. Sandra Barueco and Donald Hernandez. Sandra Barueco is an Associate Professor of Psychology and the Director of Latin American and Latino Studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Dr. Barueco's research uses a prevention science framework to examine and address developmental and mental health difficulties among young language minority, immigrant, and migrant children. Don Hernandez is a professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center City University of New York. Dr. Hernandez's research focuses on historical and contemporary change in the lives of children and families, with particular attention to immigrants and public policy. He currently is conducting research on disparities in child well-being by race, ethnicity, immigrant, and socioeconomic status. Before proceeding, I'd like to point out that the views expressed in this presentation and the associated publication do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, the Administration for Children and Families, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. With that, I will turn it over to Ann Rivera for her introductory remarks, and then Lena Guzman will provide a brief overview of the center, followed by the presentation of the study findings. Ann?
Thank you, Mike. And thank you to the Center for the opportunity to introduce the significance of this work for ACF. As you know, the Administration for Children and Families is a division of the Department of Health and Human Services and administers several federal programs designed to promote the economic and social well-being of families, children, individuals, and communities. ACF continuously seeks to strengthen its policies and programming to meet the service needs of low-income and vulnerable populations, and ACF has identified strategic goals of supporting underserved and underrepresented populations. To this end, over the years, ACF has funded several research efforts to examine the service needs and experiences of Hispanic children and families. One of these efforts has been bringing together an interdisciplinary group of experts starting in May 2011 to help ACF identify research priorities concerning low-income and vulnerable Hispanic populations. From our very first conversation, this group emphasized the need for better data in the nationally representative survey data sets that scholars and federal agencies rely on. The work group insisted that building the knowledge base relevant to ACF's areas of concern requires improving the data available to support unpacking the diversity of the Hispanic population in the U.S. Last year, these conversations culminated in ACF publishing a brief titled Survey Data Elements to Unpack Diversity of Hispanic Populations. This resource summarizes the work group's recommendations for key data elements to be collected more consistently in large-scale surveys. You may already be familiar with one of the publicly available data sets sponsored by ACF. Some of these include Head Start Family and Child Experiences Survey, known as FACES, the Head Start Impact Study, the National Survey of Child and Adolescent Wellbeing, or NSCA, and many others. While ACF works to improve the data we collect to inform our programs and policies, we also want to help build capacity in the field to conduct high-quality research on issues of relevance to ACF concerning Hispanic populations. By 2020, just 5 years from now, we expect that 1 in 4 children in the U.S. will be Hispanic. We recognize that we must build the data sources now in order to address our questions in the very near future. In addition to advancing our understanding about low-income Hispanic families with new original research, ACF also supports the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families to help strengthen research capacity in the field to address ACF's concerns through various efforts, including developing and sharing tools and resources for the broader field. I hope that the information shared in the brief Improving Data Infrastructure to Recognize Hispanic Diversity in the United States and in today's webinar will help build capacity in the field to conduct more rigorous and valid research, not just about Hispanic communities, but about cultural and linguistic minority groups in the U.S. And ultimately, I hope it will help us to improve policies and programs to better serve low-income and vulnerable populations. Thank you for attending today's webinar, for your interest in this topic, and for your contributions toward improving our understanding of the experiences and human service needs of our most vulnerable populations, and in turn, supporting ACF's work to meet the existing and emerging needs in our communities. I hope that you gain new insights from today's discussion that will support the work that you do. Now I turn to Lena Guzman to discuss the center's work.
Thank you, Anne. And again, bienvenidos and welcome to those of you who are joining us. Before we get started on the focus of today's webinar, I'd like to spend a few moments talking about why a research center on Hispanic children and families is needed. The answer, we believe, lies in 4 demographic facts. First, today, roughly 1 in 4 of all children and 17% of the general population in the U.S. is Hispanic. Hispanics represent the largest and one of the fastest growing racial ethnic minority groups in the U.S. Given these demographic trends, how Hispanics fare will have profound implications for the future well-being of our country. Second, economic security is precarious for many Hispanic children. Roughly a third live in poverty, and 2/3 live in low-income families, defined as those with income less than twice the poverty line. In other words, the majority of Hispanic children are part of the target population of many government programs and policies. Third, the vast majority, over 90% of Hispanic children are U.S. born. In fact, recent increases in the Latino population are being driven not by immigration, but by births. And fourth, although the vast majority of Latino children are U.S. born, the immigrant experience is a reality for many. Roughly half have at least one parent who was born outside of the U.S., and roughly 3/4 speak a language other than English at home. As we think about our programs and policies and how best to support low-income Latino children and families, it's important to consider these families' experiences as well as the diversity of the Latino population. This is particularly important because data suggests that Hispanics have lower rates of participation in government programs and services despite their relatively high levels of poverty. And with this in mind, the Administration for Children and Families, as Ann noted, has invested substantial funds to launch a national research center on Hispanic children and families. The center is a hub of research to help programs and policy better serve low-income Hispanic children and families around 3 priority areas: poverty and economic self-sufficiency, healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood, and early care and education. We do this in 3 ways. First, by advancing a cutting-edge research agenda across our priority areas. Second, by building an extensive network of partners, supporting emerging scholars, and developing a knowledge base and tools for the broader community. Today's webinar and the brief on which it's based is part of this effort. By shedding light on the data infrastructure needs, providing tools to researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, we hope to further build the knowledge base that can in turn be used to inform policies and programs. And third, by implementing innovative communication and dissemination strategies. It's critical to our mission that the work of the center gets in the hands of key stakeholders and policymakers such as yourselves. And now I'd like to turn to the topic of today's webinar, measuring the diversity of Hispanic communities in the U.S. So why do we need to do this, and why does this matter? We've all seen them, photographs or pictures that change depending on the angle or the distance of the viewer. What may appear to be a portrait of a person or a place from far away, in reality, is thousands of smaller snapshots from close up. The same phenomena happens when large-scale data is used to study populations. One picture emerges when the population is examined as a whole, and another when the data is examined more closely. And this is particularly true for Hispanics, who, as we've talked about already, are one of the most diverse racial ethnic groups in the U.S. While there is certainly value in studying Hispanics as a whole, paying attention to the diversity within the Hispanic population across a wide range of characteristics provides a much more complete picture and can help us target programs and policies more efficiently and effectively. Simply put, the more surveys include comparable data elements to measure diversity, and the more elements of diversity are included, the greater the potential to harness information across data sets. Imagine, for example, if all federal statistical surveys collected the same data to measure the diversity of the Hispanic population. We could then patch together a portrait of education, health, and economic well-being of Hispanics across our various data efforts that told us not only how Hispanics as a whole are faring, but how the foreign-born, Salvadorians, and those with limited English proficiency, for example, are doing. And to help underscore this point, I will provide the example of poverty and how that picture differs when we look at poverty among Hispanics through different dimensions of the Hispanic population. Overall, as I noted at the outset, roughly a third of Hispanic children are living in poverty. However, as you can see here, this differs by the nativity status of parents, with children with immigrant parents having higher levels of poverty than those whose parents are born in the U.S. The experience of poverty also differs by country of heritage, where we see the poverty rates ranging from a low of 18% for children of South American descent to a high of 35% for children of Dominican descent. And this is what we know about the experience of poverty among Hispanics from the currently available data. And this is likely to be the tip of the iceberg. We could understand much more by adding to our data infrastructure. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Lizzie Wildsmith. Lizzie?
Thanks, Lena. Although it's critical to measure the diversity of Hispanics for the reasons Lena just highlighted, an ongoing challenge is the lack of data available to measure that diversity. In the brief we're talking about today, just released by the Center, we provide some basic information about what is and what is not available in many frequently used data sets to measure diversity. The work I'm about to discuss builds directly on a 2014 brief written by the Hispanic Research Work Group referenced by Anne earlier. This brief identified 10 data elements surveys could use to better understand the diversity of Hispanics in the U.S. These data elements, which tap demographic, cultural, socioeconomic, and political aspects of people's lives, are listed here and include Hispanic ancestry and heritage, country of birth, parent country of birth, U.S. citizenship, time spent in the U.S., languages spoken at home, English speaking proficiency, literacy in any language, highest educational level outside of the U.S., and legal residency status. As Lena already noted, and as a growing body of research makes clear, when variation within each of these domains is examined, pretty important differences in the lived lives of Hispanics emerge. Poverty rates are not the same for all subgroups of Hispanics, neither are teen birth rates or rates of human service program use, and on and on. Although it will always be important to provide snapshots of large demographic groups, such as Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, when the aim is to better understand the subpopulation in order to more effectively target resources or help meet critical needs, a more nuanced understanding of how the group is doing is needed. The goal of the brief we published was to identify which of the recommended data elements were available in large-scale data sets most often used to examine how well children and their families do across a range of issues, such as health, education, and socioeconomic well-being. We identified 34 data sets, and for each, identified which data elements were included. There were 3 possible responses. 1 and 2 were pretty straightforward. Yes, the data set did include at least one measure which fully captured the data element. No, the data set did not include a measure of the data element. It quickly became clear, however, that some surveys had measures that only sort of got at each data element. We identified these as partial measures. Surveys could sort of get at the data elements in several ways, including having measures that did not fully capture the desired information. For example, including a measure that asks about speaking and reading or writing ability in English, but not distinguishing between them. Second, having a measure which was only asked for some subset of Hispanics. For example, asked only of dual language learners. And lastly, if there was no measure that explicitly captured a data element, but for which information might be learned in some other way. For example, using language of interview, such as English or Spanish, as an approximation for home language. I show an example of what this looks like in the table on the next slide, on this slide. So here is a snapshot of the table that is included in the brief. I realize that it is pretty impossible to see here, so you'll have to get a copy of our brief to do that. However, to give you a clearer sense of what you can see in the table, if you could move to the next slide, please. So to give you a clear sense, here is the same information for just one survey, the American Community Survey, or ACS. If you look across this row, you will see that the ACS includes 6 of the 10 data elements: Hispanic ancestry heritage, country of birth, for the person who is the focus of the survey, U.S. citizenship, length of time in the U.S., language spoken at home, and English speaking proficiency. The ACS does not include parent country of birth, literacy in any language, educational attainment outside of the U.S., or legal residency. After doing this for each data set, we then summarize the data in order to assess which data elements were the most frequently measured and which were not. So looking across these data sets as a whole, what do we see? Well, first, the news is quite good. Although no data set included measures for all 10 of the data elements, roughly 70% of the data sets, or 24 of the 34 data sets, included measures for at least half of the recommended data elements. Perhaps not surprisingly, these were most often demographic in nature and included country of birth, home language, parent country of birth, Hispanic ancestry, heritage, and time in the U.S. Collectively, these measures can provide us with a vast amount of important information on the diversity of Hispanics, and in fact, many other ethnic groups. However, because there's always a however, there is room for improvement, particularly when it comes to including data elements that seek to measure the social position of Hispanics. Less than 70%, and in some cases much less than 70% of the data sets included measures of English-speaking proficiency, citizenship status, literacy, or education outside of the U.S. And only 12% of data sets included a measure of legal residency status. Although this last measure can be quite sensitive, it is particularly critical to think about. A recent study just published by Doug Massey in Pathways estimates that over 50% of immigrant Hispanics from the top 5 sending countries are undocumented. We know that half of Hispanic children have at least one foreign-born parent. No doubt then, a sizable number of Hispanic children, particularly low-income children, have at least one undocumented parent. This matters when we know that challenges associated with being undocumented can impact both the need for human services and the desire and ability to use them. Data collection efforts are continuously being developed and updated. What steps can they take to help improve our understanding of Hispanics? Well, first, we can encourage all of them to include more measures to better capture diversity. Even the data sets with the most data elements have room for improvement. This is important because the behaviors and well-being of Latinos differ so substantially across the dimensions of diversity discussed today that not including them can lead to inaccurate information about important subgroups in the Hispanic population and about the Hispanic population as a whole. Second, data collection efforts should update existing measures to more fully assess diversity. For example, although most data sets contain a measure of Hispanic subgroup heritage, in many cases the possible response categories are limited to Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, or other Hispanic. Though these capture some of the largest group of Latinos in the U.S., recent immigrants are increasingly from Central and South America, and Salvadorans now make up the U.S.'s third largest Hispanic group. Finally, data collection efforts should incorporate other important, though less utilized, measures to extend our understanding of Hispanic diversity. For example, measures that indicate a person's place in society, such as citizenship, legal residency status, or literacy, are less prevalent than our measures of Hispanic heritage or country of birth. However, these measures of social position are more critical than ever in shaping accessibility and barriers to resources in the U.S. While there is value in studying Hispanics as a whole, understanding diversity within the Hispanic population provides a more complete picture and can help programs and policies support low-income Hispanics more effectively and efficiently. Ultimately, the greater the extent to which surveys include comparable data elements to measure the diversity within the Hispanic population, the greater the potential to harness this information across data sets and domains to form a more comprehensive picture of the characteristics and well-being of Latinos in this country. Thank you.
And now we'll turn it over to our next speaker, Sandra Barueco.
Hello, everybody. I'll be speaking today about why improving our measurement of the diversity of Hispanics matters for developing research agendas in program implementation. Next slide, please. Next slide. Let's discuss the present status of the research field. As others have already mentioned on this webinar, we have often limited details available about Hispanic study participants. This has led us to be in a state where we have inconsistent findings about Hispanics, from even very basic descriptive information to the extent to which programs may benefit Hispanic children and families. We need a greater understanding of the patterns of our data and the results for various dimensions of interest for programs, such as the degree of parent engagement and how this might vary across various subgroups and the diversity of Hispanics, mental health prevalence rates and its implications for the types of services that are provided and how they are provided. And we have some preliminary data already in the field that there are important variations by some groups, but sometimes it's very difficult to really see that pattern because it's obscured by not having enough details about the Hispanic study participants. Third, this of course leads us to inherent limitations in the applicability of these findings to improving policy and practice, as well as advancing our underlying theoretical frameworks. It's important for us to get to a place for programmatic implementation to know what works for whom and under what circumstances, and also ultimately to what extent. Finally, an important piece of the field is that there are consistent, persistent questions about the implications of similarities and differences within the Hispanic community for practice and policy. There are often questions for us to identify what are the differences that are important for programs and their implementation. Rather than to assume a singular approach for a program for all Hispanics, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, to assume that all different types of programs are needed for the diversity of Hispanics. Next slide. What are the implications of improved measurement of Hispanic diversity? Well, they are quite substantial. Number one, we walk away with an enhanced understanding about the composition of Hispanic families across the United States and how the community might be changing over time, and thus refine our programs to meet those changing needs. Two, an important piece is to have an understanding and increased knowledge about the inclusion of Hispanic subgroups in research endeavors. Since we have quite variable measurement of the diversity of Hispanics and their characteristics, we don't know necessarily the extent of participation and representation of Hispanics in our present studies. This leads us to improved interpretability of research findings and the generalizability of findings for improving, enhancing programs. And that leads us to talking about number 4, which is the augmented applicability of results in developing targeted, effective policies and programs for Hispanics in general, if that is what's needed, or on the other end, quite refined, focused interventions for subgroups of Hispanics. Next slide. Finally, in which research endeavors does measuring Hispanic diversity matter? And we will argue, or I will argue, that it is in all research endeavors. First, in assessment and measurement development, the types of questions that we ask, the types of assessment measures we use in both the programs as well as in our small-scale and large-scale research study matter for the different subgroups. We know that there are variations in the types of responses that we receive depending on the type of question that we ask. We know that even something so simple as the words that we utilize in a question can vary across various subgroups. For many of you on the phone, you understand some of the dialectical considerations for Hispanic subgroups. We consider words that might be very basic in an English questionnaire or an assessment with a child, such as a word such as car. We know is used differently across the different Hispanic subgroups of countries of origins. It could be carro, coche, automobile. Questions, a word such as snack or straw can also be utilized differently across the different Hispanic subgroups. In considering assessment and measurement development, it's not only considering the different Hispanic countries of origins. We also need to have appropriate representation by individuals who have varied levels of bilingualism, English proficiency, SES. And these are the approaches that need to be utilized in this area of research. Secondly, in terms of cross-sectional surveys and descriptive studies of the community and of programs, we need a solid understanding of the participation of Latino subgroups across multiple dimensions within and across the programs, and understanding who is participating, to what extent, and what are the barriers to those types of engagement into our programs. Third, importantly, the longitudinal investigations of Latino child and family development, engaging and incorporating all these questions of Hispanic diversity improves our ability to identify whether there are different trajectories in development for different types of children, and what are the implications of that for the types of programs that we have available for them. And then finally, understanding that Hispanic diversity is critical for improving our intervention studies of programs and policies. Coming and circling back to a topic that I brought up before, improving Hispanic diversity measurement improves our ability to identify which programs work for whom and under what conditions, and how can we substantively improve them to enhance the outcomes for all Hispanic children and families.
Thank you, Sandra. And now we'll turn it over to our final presenter, Don Hernandez.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. As I discussed the 10 data elements for measuring Hispanic diversity that are presented in the National Center's brief, I'd like to focus especially on Hispanic children in the context of their family situation. For the purpose of focusing on public policy, I'm going to distinguish 3 sets of surveys reviewed in the brief: 12 that focus on educational success, 8 that focus on health, and 14 that focus on family well-being and economic circumstances. Extensive research spanning decades has found that economic deprivation is the most critical non-school factor in determining the educational success of children, and that economic deprivation is strongly related to health. Overall, 2/3 of Hispanic children live in low-income families falling below twice the federal poverty threshold. This ranges from 55% for those with U.S.-born parents to 71% for those with immigrant parents. But there are enormous differences across different country of origin groups, depending on parental English language skills and parental education. I'll focus on 2 groups of Hispanic children. 1, those living with only English fluent parents, and 2, those living with only English language learner parents. To highlight the diversity of the Hispanic population, I'll present statistics from the American Community Survey for 4 origin groups. 1, children with immigrant parents from Cuba. 2, children with immigrant parents from Guatemala. 3, Puerto Rican children living on the mainland whose parents were born in Puerto Rico. And 4, children with immigrant parents from Mexico. Next slide, please. In these groups, the percent with English fluent only parents is 53% for Cuba, 30% for Guatemala, 59% for Puerto Rico, and 18% for Mexico. At the other extreme, many children live with only ELL parents, 34% from Cuba, 55% from Guatemala, 25% for Puerto Rico, and 64% for Mexico. Next slide, please. The low-income rates for these language groups differ enormously, ranging from 17 to 54% for children. Next slide, please. There we go, thank you. The low-income rates for these language groups differ enormously, ranging from 17 to 54% for children with origins in Cuba, from 34 to 70% for Guatemala, from 50 to 80% for Puerto Rico, and from 46 to 77% for Mexico. Children are also much more likely to succeed in school and to be healthy if their parents have higher levels of education. But again, we see enormous differences across countries of origin and parental English language skills. Next slide, please. The percentage with parents who have not completed high school jumps from 6 to 24%, comparing Cuban children with immigrant parents who are English fluent and those who are English language learners. The corresponding results are 18 to 67% for children with origins in Guatemala, 18 to 39% for children with origins in Puerto Rico, and 31 to 68% for children with origins in Mexico. These results suggest there are enormous differences across country of origin groups and across parental English language fluency groups in the educational and health needs of Hispanic children in the U.S. To understand and address these needs, major national surveys should include as many as possible of the 10 data elements listed in the National Center's brief. Although 33 of the 34 surveys include some of these questions, none collects all 10 data elements. Let's begin with the 12 education surveys. 10 of the 12 ask about Hispanic or ancestry or heritage, but the National Household Survey of Education and the brand new National Survey of Early Education and Care do not collect even this most basic information. Most, but not all, do ask about country of birth and parents' country of birth, which makes it possible to determine whether the respondent is a first, second, or later generation immigrant from a specific country. But most do not ask about U.S. citizenship, and none ask questions that distinguish undocumented immigrants from documented immigrants. Despite the U.S. Supreme Court decision Plyler versus Doe in 1982 that all children in the U.S. have the right to an education, including undocumented children, and despite the fact that most of the 4 million children in the U.S. with undocumented parents are themselves U.S. citizens because they were born in the U.S., Hiroyoshi Yoshikawa of New York University and colleagues have found that children with undocumented parents often experience poorly developed cognitive skills as early as age 2, which can negatively impact their future school performance and eventually their job prospects. These child outcomes are associated with undocumented parental stress, economic hardship, and avoidance of center-based childcare. Yet none of the major education surveys provide information to estimate the size, characteristics, or geographic dispersal of this population. Without relevant information, many children are destined to fall behind in school and in life because we do not have the data resources to identify the needs of these children or to reach out to them with the services they need to thrive. Perhaps even more surprising is that 4 of these 12 education surveys collect only partial information on English speaking proficiency or the ability to read or write, that is, literacy in any language. And 4 of the education data sets collect no information on reading or writing literacy. Without the most basic information about literacy, public and private policies that rely on these education data sets are flying blind. What about health surveys? As was true for education, most of the health surveys collect data on Hispanic ancestry or heritage, on country of birth, and on parents' country of birth. Noteworthy exceptions regarding country of birth are, however, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, the National Immunization Survey, the National Survey of Children, and the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. These 4 surveys also collect little or no information on home language, on English speaking proficiency, or on literacy in any language. Surely policymaking and program planning would benefit from including this basic information in key national health surveys. The nature of health risks experienced by diverse Hispanic groups and appropriate outreach cannot be assessed using data from these surveys because they are nearly devoid of information needed to identify the country of birth or generational status of the population, or to determine their English speaking and literacy skills in any language, let alone English. Finally, none of the health surveys reviewed in this brief, except the California Health Interview Survey, ask questions needed to distinguish between documented and undocumented immigrants. This is particularly troubling because the undocumented population often lives in the shadows of society and in the shadows of the healthcare system. And even they may be more likely than other groups to be exposed to occupational hazards, including toxic chemicals, that may find their way into the home, into the air that their children breathe, and the food that their children eat. If the California Health Interview Survey can ask the survey questions needed for this task, surely other major health surveys can do the same. What about the 14 family, economic, and well-being surveys reviewed in this brief? Again, most of the surveys obtain partial or full information on Hispanic ancestry or heritage, on country of birth, and on parents' country of birth, as well as on U.S. citizenship. But also, again, English-speaking proficiency and especially literacy in any language are seldom included in surveys focused on family economics or well-being. In addition, in surveys of this type, which may be used to develop economic development, employment, or training policies or programs, educational attainment outside the U.S. is not asked, except in the Latino panel study of income dynamics. In monitoring the needs for education and training, educational attainment in the home country may be especially useful in providing a baseline for developing new policies and programs. In closing, I'd like to highlight two sets of surveys which stand out. First, only 2 surveys obtain information for 9 of the 10 data elements recommended in this brief: the National Assessment of Adult Literacy and the National Agricultural Workers Survey. These surveys merit special recognition for going the extra mile because they collect nearly all the data elements needed to unpack the diversity of Hispanic populations. With small additions to data collections, they would have perfect scores. At the other extreme, I'd like to highlight 4 surveys which collect only 1 or none of the 10 data elements. These are the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, the National Immunization Survey, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and the National Assessment of Educational Progress. These include 3 of the nation's national health system resources and the National Report Card on the educational progress of our children. There are no doubt technical difficulties in collecting the data elements recommended in this brief, but most data collection efforts do better than collecting none or 1. I hope that the agencies responsible for these 4 surveys will consider assessing the possible value and technical opportunities for including additional data elements needed to unpack the diversity of Hispanic populations with regard to health and their educational accomplishments. The 1/4 of our children who are Hispanic today and who will constitute 1 in 4 persons in our labor force only 25 or 30 years from now, and all Americans deserve no less. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don and Sandra and Lena and Lizzie. Before we open it up for questions and answers, I want to give one little comment that in addition to the research brief that was highlighted today, we also like to give you a little sneak peek of a related resource that will be released on the Center website in the next week or 2. The Hispanic Data and Diversity Tool is an interactive web-based tool developed for the Center by several of my colleagues at Apt Associates. This new online tool lets users quickly parse the 34 publicly available large data sets, in case you weren't able to keep up with Don's great analysis. And it's based on the individually customized approach to selecting among the different variables examined in the research brief, such as the years the data was collected, the various types of information captured on Hispanics, and how the data was collected. This new resource will allow researchers to get their projects off the ground faster and with a more efficient approach to determining the best data set to use to address their specific research questions of interest. So stay tuned. That will be coming out relatively soon when we get ready to post the questions, the webinar and the slides from today's presentation. With that, I'd like to open it up for some of the questions that have come in, and we'll still be taking some questions during the remainder of our time period, but let's start with one, and I'll open it up and then try and target some of our presenters. First one's a relatively easy one, and that is, can you talk more about how this project started? And maybe Lena or Ann?
Sure, Ann, would you like to just provide a little background, and then we can add to that, since this really began and originated with the work of the Administration for Children's Hispanic Work Group?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, ACF had convened a work group of comprised of experts. They were both researchers as well as practitioners in basically across the different areas of concern that ACF focuses on. So it included folks from health, from self-sufficiency, from a wide variety of human service areas, teen pregnancy, child welfare. And our hope was to help ACF really think about how we could strengthen the research we were doing and identify research, some priorities concerning Hispanic populations in the U.S. and in particular low-income and vulnerable Hispanic children and families. And so from the very first conversation in 2011, that group made it very clear that the data that many of them rely on and that we even rely on to help inform us about what the needs are in the U.S. Was inadequate to really understand and understand just the heterogeneity of experiences and needs within the Hispanic communities in the U.S. And so over the next 4 years, right after that first conversation, we actually brought a smaller group from that group together and began some very intensive conversations, including Don was part of that smaller group, and we were fortunate to, just get very enthusiastic participation by a few people to kind of come to a preliminary list of variables that across the different areas of concern and across their different, the areas that they work in, they felt were very important. And so we brought these back to the larger group and really with the larger group narrowed it down to 10 survey data elements that everyone was in agreement, and this doesn't mean that there weren't other variables that people, really felt were important, but we were trying to focus on something that could be added to the the survey data that we already typically collect, in addition to variables that are specifically important for the different areas, the foci of the different data sets. And we wanted it to be something that could be added and would take no more than 5 minutes to administer. And so we came down to this list of 10 data elements that the group felt strongly would be wonderful if we could add these systematically and very consistently across the large-scale data collections that ACF sponsors, but that potentially other agencies also sponsor.
Thanks, Anne. And to add to that, when the National Center launched, one of the things that was already clear but became even clearer once we started doing some analysis, really in the first year of the center's existence, we really focused on describing the characteristics and experiences of low-income Hispanics and working through with lots of large national data sets, including the American Community Survey and others. And obviously, anyone who has worked with Hispanic, the population doing research with Hispanic population, quickly realizes very quickly that the patterns that one sees when we look at Hispanics overall differs very greatly once we start looking at subgroups, whether that's by nativity status, country of heritage, or other types of characteristics. So that became very clear to us at the Hispanic Center and was really one of the issues that we kept talking about every time we met. And as part of the center, we're not only spearheading our own research agenda, but we're also trying to make sure that we provide capacity for the broader community and provide the very tools that the broader research community might need or can use to build the knowledge base for Hispanics. So we decided very quickly, it was one of the really early on decisions, that we should take the next step to the brief that the ACF work group had done and take a look at, do a scan of what the national data sets and had covered in terms of these 10 data elements to get a sense of what was the already existing raw potential in our statistical infrastructure to understand and clarify the experiences and characteristics of the Hispanic population. So with that in mind, we began with looking at the data sets that were covered by the priority areas of the center, and expanded it a little bit to include education and health. Our list is not intended to be exhaustive, but it is intended to be as comprehensive as possible. And we quickly discovered that there's quite good news in the sense that, as Lizzie noted, while none of the data sets include all the 10 data elements, we do have quite a bit of data, especially around 5 of the indicators, that really cover the demographics, such as country of heritage, nativity status, and so forth. But we have much less potential in terms of what we consider sort of social capital characteristics, such as language proficiency or education attained outside of the U.S. And Lizzie or Don, would you like to add anything?
I'll just add briefly that we were very excited, and I was certainly excited as a member of the original advisory group, and other people were too, for the opportunity to think systematically about how we could improve the national statistical system with regard to data collection for Hispanics in particular. As people know, and as is noted in slides, 1 in 4 children are now Hispanic, and that means that 1 in 4 persons in the labor force about 25 or 30 years from now is going to be Hispanic, and yet we know very little about them. And the slides that I showed were really intended to highlight how incredibly important it is to be able to unpack and look separately at different groups, because they have very different circumstances, they have very different needs, and to develop policies that are going to be effective and outreach that's going to work. It's really important to get into these details. So it was just an exciting opportunity to offer some ideas to help the national statistical system do a better job at what it does so well, which is collect national data on health, education, and welfare.
Great. Thanks so much, Don. There have been a lot of great questions that have been coming in, and several of the questions, I'll kind of summarize across them. Several of the questions have asked about a number of different variables like gender and family structure, and I just want to reiterate that the focus of this, as Lena and Lizzie had talked about earlier, really are focusing on those variables that relate to understanding the specific issues around the heterogeneity of the Hispanic population. So a lot of these other variables are important, and important demographic and other characteristics, and so it's not that those aren't important, but that those are, the focus of this was really kind of, as Don and others have been saying, it's really to kind of capture the richness of the variability within the Hispanic population.
And one thing I would want to add to that is that while these were certainly elements or data elements that were identified as being important to understanding the diversity of the Hispanic population, many, if not all, of these apply to immigrant and other vulnerable populations. So this is not only helping to improve the data infrastructure around Hispanics, but also around all understanding the experiences of many of our immigrant groups and populations.
Okay.
And I just want to emphasize as well, because this might not come across very clearly to everyone, but these are in addition to, these were recommended, and we really, our conversations with the work group were really thinking about what would you add to what is commonly collected, what is already commonly collected, most commonly in these large data sets that we rely on. What would you add to it to make sure that we were collecting that really would allow us to better understand who we were talking about when we have this group that has been identified as Hispanic using, the kind of most common survey items that these days that are, usually they include the question about Hispanic ethnicity. Well, but we wanted to really unpack that. So what would you add beyond that? So the assumption is that whatever, these data collections, all of these data collections have particular research objectives and questions in mind, and decisions are being made already about what kinds of survey items need to be included and are really a priority. So, but in addition to those, you know, if a study, if a particular data set wanted to be able to provide information that would allow us to ask questions about Hispanics within the sample, what else would we need to know to really understand who we were talking about and what their experiences were?
Great, thanks, Anne. I'm gonna mix it up a little bit here, because I think that a lot of the presentations and a lot of the discussion back and forth and the questions have focused on all the positive reasons for why we need to do this work in a much more rich, expanded way. So one of the questions that came in slightly amended is, do you think that collecting additional information on surveys could pose a problem by making the surveys too long? It's one that came up in a conversation with our 2 new summer research fellows, a little plug for our summer fellowship program. And that is really that how do you prioritize when you're often having to make choices? How do you prioritize? Because people can understand and appreciate after these kinds of conversations the importance of having the richness of these variables, but it comes at a cost in terms of time, length, and et cetera. So how do we balance out those very practical realities of cost considerations when you're putting together a new study? And I'm going to open that up to, I don't know which of you all would be the best to answer that question.
Well, this is Lena, and I can start talking about this. I think one of the things that I would underscore is something Anne mentioned earlier, that these were 10 data elements that one could reasonably collect data on, all 10 of them within 5 minutes or less. And likely, given the types of questions that they are, some of them are very sort of demographic oriented, which usually are very easy to answer, could even be collected in less time. But completely recognize that every minute in a federal statistical survey probably costs $1 million or more. I mean, that's one of the first things that I learned when I moved to DC, when I was at a meeting from the National Institutes of Health, that really, and this is over a decade ago, so it's probably closer to $2 million, that every minute in a federal statistical survey can easily cost $1 million. So these are very real decisions and very real important considerations. But again, I would underscore that 1 in 4 of all children in this country are Hispanic, and if we don't understand their characteristics and experiences, we're going to be very, potentially very inefficient and potentially even ineffective in our programs and policies. So while it is a costly endeavor to build this data infrastructure, it is perhaps can be in the long run very cost effective by helping us to improve our programs and policies to serve, again, 1 in 4 of all children. Anne and others, if you would like to add.
I just wanted to add that, you know, from the federal perspective, these are really hard decisions. I mean, these are decisions that, you know, researchers who are leading smaller scale studies have to make and are difficult. And at the federal level, it's just as difficult because, as Lena said, you know, every survey item that we add has a considerable, you know, price tag attached to it. So ultimately, any study or data collection really has to have the research objectives and questions in mind. And whatever the, you know, some of these items will be more or less relevant given the particular focus of a study and what the theories are that might, that one hopes to test or to, you know, be able to generate data to address. And so in the original brief that we published in 2014, we actually also include kind of what the underlying constructs are, some of the underlying constructs associated with, you know, that are represented by these data elements. And that, you know, is hopefully, so as people are making difficult decisions, but they do want to do a better job of collecting some of this information, you know, hopefully that can help guide people in thinking about, you know, how this relates to the particular research objectives of their specific data collection.
Thank you, Anne. So since we're pretty much out of time, I want to close with one of the questions and lead to our closing. And that question was, how can researchers contribute to expand the conversation on the need to conduct research on Hispanic diversity? And that's a lingering question. I mean, that's what we're all here to do. So on behalf of the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, we'd like to thank you all for your interest in the center, this new research brief, and for taking the time to attend this webinar. Special thanks to our discussants and our other panelists for their important contributions